Today we're going to cover a little bit about the history of plant names, how they can be problematic in the first place, and then we're going to cover the project that I worked on that just starts to address this issue, sort of ending up with some interesting thoughts and concepts and further conversations. So we're going to start with sort of plant names and the history of plant names. So categorizing plants is something that humans have been doing for the entirety of our history. All cultures have some sense or some sort of folk taxonomy. So obviously it was important for us as early hominids to be able to communicate what plants were good for us, what plants may be harmful for us, and everywhere in between. As early as 3000 BC, Shen Yang of China was recording medicinal plant information in pharmacopedias. There are Egyptian wall paintings depicting medical plants as far back as 1500 BC. Aristotle made the really bold argument to categorize things in two different overarching categories, plants and animals, in the 300s BC. That was not received very well by the church because according to the church, humans should not be lumped with animals, but that's a whole other presentation for a whole nother time. Dioscorides was classifying over 500 plants in one of his medical botany texts in the 1st century AD. And then there were a whole host of other scientific botanists that were naming, classifying, and recording plants all the way up into the 1700s, giving way to Linnaeus. So if you remember back to your high school biology class, you probably remember Carl Linnaeus's name. He is the one who is sort of lauded as proposing and publishing the system of classification that would eventually become the scientific standard for plants and animals. So in 1735, he published Systema Naturae, and that was later revised 12 times throughout his career. He is generally seen as the father of modern taxonomy. But what's really interesting is as this sort of acceptance of his classification system came about, that also sort of superseded all of that earlier folk taxonomy, all of that earlier cultural taxonomy. So every plant and animal pre-1753, so at the time of, I think, the 10th edition of his writing, regardless of cultural traditions or languages, is considered invalid by modern taxonomists. And it also, his work became problematic because in his 10th edition of Systema Naturae, he listed 4 varieties of humans. And this first sort of initial categorization of human subtypes was based largely on geography. So a lot of botany, taxonomy, it's Eurocentric, right? And a lot of the Latinized words that we use in that are based on geography from a European standpoint. So we have the word orientalis, which traditionally is used for anything east of Europe, occidentalis for everything west. Regardless, by the 10th edition in 1758, he starts to sort of expand on these writings and starts adding attributes for the different classifications. So these attributes included things like skin color, the medical temperaments. So he split the groups up into the 4 humors, hair, eye, and facial traits. And then it started getting interesting because he started using things like clothing and government and behavior into these classifications. So a lot of the descriptors were pretty surface level at best. For example, for the European subtype of human, he used words like light and wise, inventor, governed by rights, and muscular to describe that group. While the other subgroups got words like sallow, stiff, greedy, unyielding, sly, sluggish, or neglectful. And Originally he thought that these traits were due to climate and customs. So his logic wasn't inherently founded in biological racism, but it is marked as making way for scientific racism. So that initial categorization by Linnaeus into those different groups and given attributes wrongly legitimized the idea that race is a biological fact rather than social construct. And these ideas sort of influence and go all the way up to being cited as a significant rationale of Nazi wartime racial theory as well as eugenics. So not great stuff coming from this idea of creating a standardized way of classifying things. We went a little astray there. And one of the more interesting consequences of the adoption of Linnaeus's structure of natural categorization is language erasure. So persimmon is a good example. So our native U.S. persimmon has indigenous names in numerous languages. The common name that we adopted in English comes from the Algonquin Puchaman, Pasiminon, or Pessimin from the roots pas, which means dry, and men, meaning fruit. So the plant had more specific names before that, though, in other languages. So in Cherokee, it was Shali, or in Choctaw, Unkof. But instead of adopting any of these more culturally significant, specific descriptive terms, science uses Diosporos virginiana as its Latinization. Diosporus, the genus name coming from the Greek dios, meaning gods, and pyros, meaning fruit, and virginiana, meaning of or from Virginia, which is interesting because the persimmon is native to over 30 U.S. states, but it was recorded and Latinized by colonists in Virginia. And this whole process of Latinization to create a scientific or botanical name is kind of broad strokes at best, because 80% of genera names and 30% of species names aren't actually rooted in Latin at all. So a lot of times they will be Latinizations of either people that botanists were celebrating, or any number of sort of odd descriptors or languages, including Greek. And so there's a really great quote from an excellent podcast episode of Camden Art Audio. The episode is called The Coloniality of Planting. And the quote reads, "Botany emerged with exploratory voyages that European colonial powers sent around the world. In a sense, botanists became agents of empire." And we see this across several sort of plant stories of the swashbuckling collecting past, but we see it most often in plants that provide some sort of economic value. So the story of rubber is an appropriate example of this, containing a number of the hallmark elements of colonial botany. So for centuries, cultures in tropical South American and the Caribbean islands have been extracting white sap from the rubber tree for waterproofing textiles, container making, and creating small sort of balls and toys, things like that. In 1490s, Christopher Columbus was cited as observing rubber use in Haiti, but it wasn't really until 1736 when rubber was introduced to France and later made its way through Europe as a useful material that things really started to change and take off for rubber use worldwide. Throughout the 1800s, rubber was collected using indigenous slave labor in a particularly grueling process in South America of collecting the sap from wild populations of the rubber tree, which a lot of times were deep in the Amazonian jungle. So all of these rubber plantations had a really hard time because it was a dangerous process. So they would constantly be losing people doing the work to various tropical diseases, weather, all sorts of things that come from, the inherent risk of wandering through the Amazon. And Brazil sort of kept a really tight control on the movement of rubber plant and seeds because of business interests. It was a super lucrative product. Brazil sort of wanted to hang on to that economic power. But in 1876, seed was smuggled out of Brazil by Henry Wickham and brought to Kew Gardens in England. And seedlings from this collection were sent to a number of colonized Pacific islands, which eventually became enslaved plantations for mass production and exportation of that rubber. And clearly with that comes a lot of cultural damage. We have seen a couple examples of lasting scars of taxonomy and botany, including scientific nomenclature offering a false legitimacy to the claim that race is biological, the Latinization of plant names playing part in the erasure of cultural knowledge, and economic botany developing hand in hand with colonialism, including displacing indigenous communities and removing rightful resources from indigenous communities. Even the way that plants are researched today has some really big access issues. So, for example, in taxonomy, most of the research is done using herbarium specimens or type specimens. So these sort of dried pressed vouchers are what we use to name new species, categorize new species, and sort of create a standard for which the rest of the taxonomy of that species is going to be based on moving forward. But the problem is a lot of these specimens, a lot of these type specimens are stored in countries of original colonial power. So, for example, if you were a Western African resident and you wanted to study your local native flora, there's a good chance that in order to do the taxonomic work and the taxonomic research, you'd have to go somewhere like Poland to do it. So there's a whole host of things that botany, taxonomy, horticulture are sort of starting to grapple with from bygone eras of colonialism, scientific racism, all of that gnarly stuff. And a lot of this bleeds into our botanical and our common names. So specifically, I focus on common names right now. Botanical and scientific names are governed by a document lovingly referred to as the Code by people in the trade. And that's updated by the International Botanical Congress every 6 years. There's a very formalized process to requesting a plant name be changed on the grounds of cultural offense, but this process can be long and filled with paperwork. There's lots of publishing that needs to be done before these changes are even considered, and it's a lot of hoops to jump through. It's doable, but there's a lot of hoops to jump through. However, the fun thing is individual institutions can control their language use around common names. Common names are what your grandmother would have taught the plant to you as. They're regionally and linguistically diverse. There's no governing body. There's sort of an attitude, at least in public gardens, of we do what we want. We're going to pick the best common name that makes the most sense for our guests and viewership. And honestly, they're downright interesting. And all of this sort of makes common names the lower hanging fruit to tackle when we're talking about trying to find plant names that have the potential to offend people or the potential to cause problems. I'm going to use a short example here. Trigger warning, there is a ethnic and racial slur that I'm going to use in this example, specifically around Indigenous people of Central California. So if that is you and you do not want to listen to this example, I would say maybe mute this presentation for about 60 seconds or so, and then join us back. So the example that I'm going to go through is one that I've actually seen a lot of different forums get really heated over. So the two plants on the screen are Veronica perfoliata and Pinus sabiniana. So Veronica perfoliata, the cute little plant on the left, is a small Australian perennial with the common name Digger speedwell. In Australia, the name digger is sort of a colloquial slang term for an Australian soldier, given from Australian soldiers having to dig trenches during wartime. Pinus sabiniana is a Californian pine with the common name digger pine. Now, in the sense of the pine, the use of the word digger was a term first used during tensions between white communities and Central Californian First Nations in the mid-1800s. However, this has sort of been perpetuated as a racial slur in that region of the United States. So if we're thinking as a public garden and we're going to use, say we have both of these plants in our garden and we're labeling them, the word digger in a common name would have a much different emotional impact on a Californian garden guest than an Australian one would maybe. So it's sort of conversations like these where we start to look at how regionally and language specific these names really can be. So why am I the one talking to you about this? I was fortunate enough to get to help lead a pretty epic project researching existing plant common names with the potential to be problematic within modern day public gardens. So I was the chair of the Plant Nomenclature and Taxonomy Community of the American Public Gardens Association at the time that this forum post came across. And basically, this forum post was saying, you know, our institution is starting to do a lot of DEIA work. Does anybody have a good resource on common names and common names that might be problematic? This spurred one of the most active forum posts I've ever seen in my involvement with this community group. And people were really, really excited at the possibility of doing something about it, doing some research on it. So the association in general organizes and encourages engagement of about a dozen or so communities, but it's the name nerds that really sort of took hold of this. And I happened to be at the right place at the right time. So we gathered a crew of excited professionals from both the plant nomenclature and taxonomy community, as well as the Council on Botanical and Horticultural Libraries. So we had a really fun group going. So the plant nomenclature and taxonomy leadership was myself, Jess Gaylor, Laurel Hill, Beth Hoffman, and the Council on Botanical and Horticultural Libraries folks was Catherine Downing and Christine Paulus. And we really sort of set forth to figure out what we could do and what we might be able to craft in the span of a couple of years. So there was an initial forum post made in early 2020, and we sort of started batting it around as our annual project for the community in February of that year. We all know what happened in March of 2020, so things sort of took a backseat for a little bit while everybody sort of figured out this new world we were living in. But by August, we were back at it, gauging interest from the community on if this is something that they actually wanted to step up and work on. And the general sort of attitude was a big heck yes. So we started setting goals and we started asking people for their data. And then the year 2021, we really just hit it. So we got 30 institutions worth of data. We gathered volunteers to help us do the work. And we did all of the analysis and report writing in the calendar year 2021. So it was a big project and a long project, but definitely worthwhile. As that leadership group sort of started gathering and started figuring out what we were going to do, some guiding principles sort of bubbled to the surface. One of the things that we noticed very early on is that these names are messy, complex topics that can bring about a lot of emotion, confusion, sort of baggage personally as we started going through them. We also decided that we were kind of refusing to be the arbiters of what was right or wrong. And we didn't want to demonize any specific given word, but rather provide cultural or historic context for words that could be problematic and let folks sort of figure it out for themselves. We decided that each institution needed to individually do the work to establish what their local cultures, customs, and language sort of dictated in order to create an inclusive environment. The other thing is this resource is not a one-stop shop. We knew it wasn't going to be able to. There is a ton of work left to do, but for now, at least, we can sort of focus on and celebrate what we did achieve. So from 30 institutions, we gathered over 400,000 lines of common name data. Basically, people gave us data dumps of their databases, and we took whatever we could get. So we ran all of those common names against two resources. One was the Wikipedia list of ethnic slurs from February 2021. I'm pretty sure every college professor I've ever had would be shuddering at the fact that we used Wikipedia for a professional project. But the crowdsourced nature of that list was actually super important here because most of the leadership came from a very, very similar cultural background. And we wanted to make sure that we were using as wide a range of words as we possibly could. So we combined that list with the Carnegie Mellon School of Computer Science Louis von Ahn offensive/profane word list. Say that 10 times fast. But basically, once we compiled those two data sets, ran it across our 40,000 lines of data, it gave us over just 60,000 lines of data to cull through. And that's when we called in the volunteers. And those volunteers helped us whittle all of that down to about 504 common names. And then after we did some more data scrubbing and excluding cultivar names, which we'll get into in a little bit, we ended up with 227 words to analyze and define for context. So you can see my little bubbles there. What we ended up analyzing is the smallest drop in the bucket compared to the initial data set that we had to work with. But even that was a super big undertaking. So like I said, we had 30 amazing institutional contributors from all across the country. We had 49 individual volunteers that contributed over 500 hours of work to this project. Huge deal. Our volunteers represented 10 different professions across 9 of those American Public Gardens Association and Council on Botanical and Horticultural Libraries communities. And the volunteers represented 24 states and provinces in North America. So we had a really great showing from our volunteer helpers. But even with that, it was a super slow and tedious process. We asked each of our volunteers to review roughly 1,000 lines of data, but experienced quite a few that sort of had to forego the work because of other professional or personal commitments. Totally fine. We get that. We are asking folks to volunteer their times, and we know everybody's super busy. Totally fine. But that meant more work on the leadership team from the data scrubbing standpoint. So it was also really easy to get distracted while researching the origins of some of the terms. So for 1 minute, you'd be cranking through data, just cruising through dismissing things. And then suddenly you realize that you have been Googling the term Rhodesian for 2 hours. And you just went down a research rabbit hole and half your day was gone. We also had quite a few contributors that had trouble setting aside their own cultural understandings and were left sort of working through that question of how could that be offensive? There are a lot of things that, within our own cultural backgrounds, we don't necessarily see or feel as offensive. But the general goal was to sort of set this question aside and focus on whether or not the name or term could be dismissed as either a valid color or a geographical description. So, for example, if a plant name had the word Japanese in it, so like Japanese mallow or something along those lines, we were asking our volunteers to check, see if the plant was actually from Japan. And if it was, we would dismiss something like that, saying, yep, that is a valid geographic description of the plant. Same thing with certain colors, etc. And all of that being said, the nature of this project holds a huge amount of gray area and nuance, and sometimes that really caused progress to be a slog. But we did make it through, and we had some final products to show for it. So after 2 years of work, we ended up with a full 60-page report, which includes all of the context and methodology for the project, as well as a pretty thought-provoking discussion section on things that we sort of came up against as we were looking through this research. We also provide a cultural context resource at the end of that report, which defines all of the words that we pulled as potentially problematic with context and definitions. However, we suggest not just skipping to the end. We hope that folks will actually read through the report before just skipping to the dirty words, because there's a lot of important context there. We also produced a data resource that covers all of the data lines that we looked at and provides a module to cross-check your own data using our methodology. So including cross-checking against those original 1,700 profane words and phrases, as well as the more distilled 227 that we use at the end. All of those resources are free to access in the American Public Gardens Association Resource Library. And I've got a QR code on the conclusion slide. So you can scan that and access all those goodies, or I can make sure y'all have access to the link at the end of the presentation. So what I want to do is in my last sort of few minutes of actually talking before we can get into some questions and discussion is go through some of the thought provokers, the questions that we sort of used in our discussion section, things that we thought were good things to get people thinking about this and get people talking about it. So one of the examples that we like to use is black-eyed Susan. So the common name is credited as given to Rudbeckia, the genus Rudbeckia, by North American colonists in reference to John Gay's 1719 poem titled Sweet William's Farewell to Black-eyed Susan. So the poem specifically references Susan's beautiful black eyes, but a modern East Coast garden staff member sort of questioned its use as a potential trigger for domestic abuse victims. So this is a great example of how language evolves over time and in popular culture. And it sort of begs the question whether or not the modern negative interpretation trumps the English folk story origin of this common name. Why does it or why doesn't it? And what's at stake here? Another really great example we like to use is the word Caucasian. So the word Caucasian is commonly used in plant names as a geographic descriptor referencing the Caucasus Mountains or the Caucasus region, which is this great little region in Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. But what is your first association when you see the word Caucasian? Is it the geography or is it the skin color or demographic that you check off on some sort of questionnaire? Does this alter the intent of the plant's common name? What message is the one that's coming across the strongest? Is it the intent or is it the impact? So interesting question there. Another big, meaty question that we come against quite a bit, and again, we don't have right or wrong answers to this, is the term Indian. And we specifically looked at Indian in reference to North American plants. So if the common name had the word Indian in it, but the plant was actually native to the country of India, that would have been dismissed as a valid geographical reference. So do you think the word Indian carries the possibility of offense? Who gets to choose what's offensive in this case? One of the project leaders actually works really closely with an Indigenous Resource Center at a university and sort of brought this question into work with them. And one of the things that came up is, does removing Indian from a common name possibly take away a positive association of Indigenous community with a plant? And how do we start to mitigate and navigate these questions? It's a big question, right? It involves a lot of people. It involves a lot of differing opinions and a lot of plants. So those are just some sort of things we've started to dip our toe in the water of talking. But this project sort of didn't cover some broad swaths of material. So things that weren't necessarily well represented within the lists that we sort of referenced our data through. One of those is cultural and sexual stereotypes. So names referencing sexual purity, virginity, homosexuality, etc. If it wasn't in one of those profane or offensive word lists, we didn't necessarily go seek it out. And that's actually a pretty common trope in plant names, surprisingly more so in cultivar names than anything else. So that's an area of work to be explored still. A big category that we didn't really mess with was the names of colonizers, slave owners, or generally problematic historical figures. We would still be researching this for the next bazillion years if we went through this. And this is something that a lot of the scientific name communities are starting to grapple with, and definitely something that could be an interesting big project in the future. We also didn't really touch cultivar names. So plant cultivars are plants that have been bred and then are asexually propagated to maintain those traits. They're named, and there is a formalized process to changing cultivar names as part of that botanical name. So that formalized process, again, involves a lot of paperwork. It involves a lot of sort of back and forth. I had a security person just being like, why are you still here? Sorry about that. And what we found is when the cultivar name was in the common name, that is a stylistic choice. So gardens can choose not to use cultivar names within their common names, but many do. So that's sort of a whole different subset of a project for a different time. We just did not have the capacity to roll through that. That was sort of where our 400 or 504 names got cut down to 227, was when we removed the cultivars specifically. Another thing that we didn't really tinker with was outdated political or geographic boundaries. We could get really existential about imbuing human boundaries that are completely meaningless to plants in their native ranges. We could also start doing a lot of research on place names and the history of place names and whether or not plants should be using historic indigenous names for places versus modern day political names for places. It's a whole thing. We didn't open that can of worms. Finally, we didn't really delve into religious words or phrases, so we flagged a number of religious things that came up in that word list, including things like devil, Jew, etc. But we didn't necessarily feel comfortable making a call on the intention of the religious use. We sort of thought that it makes a big difference if that use is referencing religion from within the stories or lore, whether it has a positive connotation or whether that use comes from sort of a stereotype or a negative connotation. So We sort of left flag what there was, but we didn't delve into too much more situational context or anything like that. So in the work ahead, we are hoping that people will sort of take time to pause and note our own language use and the origins and the words and phrases we use both casually and professionally. We're hoping that folks start to converse with anybody impacted by plant names and start looking at this as a cross-departmental topic and through the lens of language use, cross-departmentally, internally, and externally within our institutions. We're also hoping that people start to identify local communities to partner with in language work, including budgeting for time and expertise, as well as creating projects that benefit all parties, not just sort of those of us who are hoping to create work for more inclusivity. And it's time to start talking to guests and folks that our institutions interact with on why things are changing in the language that we're using, and sort of the story and the history behind these words and their use. And sort of using that as a way to jump into conversation sessions, question sessions, and conversing about this topic with each other. There's a few sort of tidbits that we have sort of taken on board that I like to remind folks of as we start to go into talking about some of these sticky, messy topics. It's always important to speak from the I, so speak from our own experiences and not lump our experiences in with any other groups. One of my favorite tidbits that my husband and I use at home all the time is that two truths can totally coexist. I don't have to be wrong for you to be right, and vice versa. Also, the golden rule of listening to understand instead of listening just to make a response or get your voice heard. Instead of responding with statements, I like to try to stop and ask clarifying questions instead, because sometimes that helps us get to the deeper meaning or the deeper emotion of what people are getting at. I know I'm not always the best at coming up with words quickly, and so sometimes I need to take some time to get my own point across. Also recognizing if there is a heightened emotional state, it's important to sort of stop, try to identify the emotions around the topic, examine the cause, where might it be coming from, and sharing that emotion if you feel safe and comfortable enough to do so. And the goal is to create spaces where those conversations can be had and we can sort of talk about the underlying emotions and feelings behind these very uncomfortable words. And then sort of what I think is most important is understanding that intent and impact can sometimes be misaligned, and being ready to acknowledge that when that happens. A lot of times, if we misspeak or we accidentally cause harm, it's not the intent to do so, but the impact for the other person is just as real. And we need to be able to say, I'm sorry, it was not my intent, and I recognize that I impacted you negatively, and go from there and start the conversation from there. So that's, super high level primer on emotional, difficult conversations, but definitely some things that we've found useful over the course of this project, sort of working forward. So from an institutional standpoint, we're sort of looking at this as, how is this information useful to individual institutions? How do you see it being useful in the future? Who can you see working with using this information? What other parties can you see partnering with and talking about language use with? And how are you going to use this in your communities? And who can be engaged with this work?